The auctioneer had barely gotten through the parcel description when Dale Tripp leaned back in his chair and laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It came from somewhere in his chest and arrived at the front of the room with the particular confidence of a man who owns enough of a county that he's stopped worrying about how things sound in public. Tessa Mowry heard it from the third row, where she was sitting with a white envelope on her lap and her hands very still. She did not turn around. She was 28 years old. She had $274 in that envelope, which was the sum total of her savings from 3 years of ranch work in Gem County, minus what she'd spent on her father's burial and a bus ticket back to Halcott County, where Glen Mowry had lived and died, and left her nothing but a name that people in this room associated primarily with a man who had rented other people's land his entire life and died owing the county 2 seasons of back taxes on cattle he didn't own. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. She kept her hands flat. Dale Tripp said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. Glen Mowry's girl is going to bid on the reed bottom. He said it the way you announce the punchline of a joke everyone in the room already knows. Lord, she's going to bid on the reed bottom. The reed bottom was 68 acres of Slate River flood plain in the northeast corner of Halcott County. It had been owned by the Alcott family since the 1880s, farmed for 3 generations, and then abandoned sometime in the late 1980s when the last Alcott heir took one look at what had moved in from the river edge and drove back to the city without filing a forwarding address. The county had assessed the land at $90 an acre, which was not exactly nothing, but was close enough to it that the back tax debt had made the opening bid $260. Tessa bid her $200 and she won. When the gavel came down, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something has happened that the audience hasn't decided how to feel about yet. She was walking to the clerk's table when Dale Tripp stepped into her path, not blocking it, just present, the way men of a certain kind of standing make themselves present when they want someone to know they could block it if they chose. Your daddy spent 30 years on other people's land, he said. Died owing the county money on cattle that weren't his. That's a particular kind of luck that tends to follow a family. Tessa stopped. She didn't look at him right away. She stood with her back to the room and took one slow breath, the kind she had learned to take in the years since she was old enough to understand that some things people say are designed to reach you in places you can't defend. Then she turned. My father knew more about this valley than anyone else in it, she said. Her voice was even. He just never had the money to act on what he knew. She walked to the clerk's table. She paid. Behind her, she heard Dale Tripp say something, but she was no longer listening to him. If you've ever watched someone make a decision that looked completely unreasonable from the outside and secretly wondered whether they might know something everyone else had overlooked, stay with me, because that's what this story is. Before we go any further, if you're new to Western Ironwood, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell the kind of stories here that stay with you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If this one moves you, hit the like button. Now let's go back to that courthouse. Glen Mowry had died 11 weeks earlier owing the county back taxes, a feed supplier in town, and very little else, because there was very little left. He had been a gentleman. He had been the kind of man who could spend a Sunday afternoon explaining to his 9-year-old daughter why certain grasses grew where they did along a river bend. Something about soil memory and water pressure, and make it feel like the most important thing she'd ever heard. He had also been a man who planted crops on someone else's ground and paid rent on a schedule that depended entirely on the weather, and who spent the last 5 years of his life telling Tessa that things were going to come around. They had not come around. What they had done instead was resolve into $274 in a white envelope and a bus ticket from Gem County to Whitlow, the county seat, where the tax sale was being held in the Halcott County Courthouse in a third-floor room, with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, and approximately 40 people who had shown up either to buy something or to watch other people not buy things. Tessa had heard about the sale from her cousin, who still lived in the county, and sent her an email with a list of forfeited parcels and a note that said, essentially, thought you should know, though there's nothing here you'd want. She read through the list on her phone on a break from the ranch, sitting on a hay bale in a February wind. Most of the parcels meant nothing to her. But the Reed Bottom, 68 acres on the Slate River, opening bid $260, made her stop. She had known that land since she was a child. Her father had rented ground a mile upstream and used to take her to walk the edge of the Reed Bottom on Sunday afternoons when the work was done. She knew what it was. She knew why no one had farmed it in 40 years. Phragmites australis, the common reed, an invasive grass that moved into North American wetlands and did not stay near the water, but spread outward, sending up canes 12 feet tall with root systems reaching 15 feet deep, crowding out everything native and creating monocultures so dense that even determined animals couldn't push through them. The Reed Bottom had started going over to phragmites sometime in the 70s, and by the time the last Alcott walked away it was wall to wall, bank to bank, nearly impenetrable. Tessa had sat on that hay bale for a long time. She was thinking about a woman named Bess Langford. She had worked for Bess when she was 16 and again, for 2 summers after that, on a property 2 counties west, where Bess ran a small herd of Scottish Highland cattle on land that most people would have described as unusable. Bess was 72 now, and had been talking for years about being too old to manage the herd herself, though she hadn't done anything about it yet. What Bess had told her once, while they were moving fence line in the late afternoon, was that Highland cattle were the only livestock that would genuinely work phragmites. Not thin it, work it. They would eat the canes, pull at the root crowns with their teeth, wade belly deep into standing water to reach new growth, and if you rotated them correctly and gave them enough seasons, they would convert standing marsh into recoverable ground. Nobody believes it, Bess had said, until they watch it happen. And most people never watch it happen because they've already decided it can't. Tessa had not forgotten that. She had not forgotten it on the bus to Whitlow. She had not forgotten it sitting in that courthouse room with her envelope. She had not forgotten it when the gavel came down and Dale Tripp announced the punchline to a joke she wasn't in. The first night on the Reed Bottom, she set up a tent on the right-of-way outside the fence line because there was no getting into the property itself. The reed started at the fence and went straight back, a solid wall, dark and still in the flashlight beam. She lay in her sleeping bag and listened to the canes move in the river wind, and thought about everything she had planned for and everything she had not planned for, which included, specifically, the fact that she had no idea where to put a tent on 68 acres of vertical phragmites. She called Bess Langford the next morning from the county road. Bess answered on the 3rd ring. "I bought some land," Tessa said. A pause. What kind? 68 acres of phragmites on the Slate River bottom. 40 years of growth, bank to bank. There was a long silence. Then Bess made a sound that might have been a laugh. "How much did you pay?" $274. Another pause. "Your father?" "He would have." He absolutely would have. Bess's voice shifted, became slightly drier. "I have 14 animals right now. Good stock. I'm too old for the terrain." "I remember you saying that." "I've been saying it for 4 years. It keeps being true." A pause. "You have fencing?" "I have the idea of fencing." "Water?" "The river. There's a spring marked on the county plat somewhere in the interior. I haven't gotten to it yet." Bess was quiet for a moment. Tessa knew what Bess thinking sounded like. A specific quality of silence that meant she was working through something, and you did not interrupt it. "There's a man in your county," Bess said finally. "Older fellow. Goes by Clem Odom. He ran cattle on the Alcott land for 3 seasons in the 90s, before the phragmites made it impossible. He knows that bottom ground the way you know something you've lost and can't stop thinking about. White House out on Miller Road, green water tank out front." Tessa wrote it down in the margin of the plat map she was carrying. "You find a way to fence those animals, and get me a line they won't push through in the first week," Bess said, "and I'll let you use the herd for the cost of transport, and a promise that you send me pictures when the ground comes back." Tessa was very still on the gravel shoulder of the county road. "That's all?" "That's all. I want to see it come back. Land that gets written off and stays written off is the sorriest thing I know." A pause. "Glen used to say the ground remembers what it was. I always thought that was a little much. But I've been farming a long time now, and I'm less sure he was wrong." Tessa didn't trust herself to answer that directly. I'll find the fence, she said. You do that, Bess said, and hung up. Clem Odom was somewhere in his 70s, a tall man who carried the frame of someone who had been outdoors his whole life, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to say things he didn't mean. He answered his door and looked at Tessa before she said anything, with the calm assessment of a man who forms his impressions quickly and doesn't advertise them. He let her in and poured coffee. On the wall near the window there were photographs, aerial shots of the Slate River bottom from some years ago, green and open, crossed by a network of low earthen berms she recognized from old agricultural maps. That's the Alcott levee system, she said. He looked at her. You know about that. I've been reading county records. The Alcotts diverted water from the river in the 1880s. There's supposed to be a stone Millrace on the South Bend. He sat down across the table and turned his coffee mug around in both hands. He was quiet for a moment that had a specific quality of deliberation. The Millrace was there when I ran cattle on that land, he said. Stone-cut channel, dry-set granite. The Alcotts built it in 1886 to run a small grist operation. They stopped milling by 1920 but maintained the channel until the family left. After that, he paused. The Reeds came in from the south end first, covered the Millrace probably within 10 years. Why does the Millrace matter now? Tessa said. Because a structure like that, built before the State Water Code was established in 1902, constitutes a prior appropriation claim. If the structure is intact and you can demonstrate continuous use, you hold a water right that predates everything else filed in this basin. He paused, meaning you control the primary diversion point for the Slate River on the east side. The 400 acres of plateau land above your south fence has no other water source. She understood what that meant immediately. She had been doing enough reading over the past 3 weeks to understand it. You're telling me there's a reason someone is going to come looking at this property the minute it stops looking like nothing, she said. I'm telling you that a man named Bryce Alderman has been buying land on the East Bench for the past 2 years. He's from Boise, resort development, hunting properties, that kind of operation. He needs water rights for any project to be viable, and there aren't any available in this basin except what's tied up in the old Alcott claim. Clem's jaw set slightly. I don't know what Alderman knows. I know he isn't careless. Tessa sat with that for a moment. The cut on her right palm, which she'd gotten 3 days ago pushing a brush saw through the reed margin, ached in the low, persistent way of a wound that was healing on its own schedule. Will you help me? She said, not performing it, just asking. Clem looked at her for a long moment, with the same expression he'd had at the door, reassembling her from the outside, arriving at a conclusion he kept to himself. I'll come out and look at it, he said. What you do with what I tell you is your own business. It wasn't a yes, but it was the closest thing she was going to get, and she knew better than to push it. He came the next morning, at first light, which told her something about him. He stood at the edge of the reed bottom and looked at the wall of phragmites with an expression that was neither impressed nor discouraged, just accurate. Worse than I remembered, he said. I know. He examined the path she had cut. 12 feet on the first day, 8 on the second, when she hit a section where the root mass was so dense the brush saw bounced back at her. He looked at the new growth already pushing from the cut ends and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of comment. Cut at the base and leave the crowns, he said. Don't pull the roots. The cattle will handle the root system over time if you rotate them right. First season, they work the accessible growth. Second season, they start on the established canes. He paused. Third season, you start seeing ground. She nodded. The spring is about 200 yards in on a northwest angle. You're going to miss it by 30 feet if you keep your current direction. Adjust right. There are cattail stands along the east edge, she said. I've been thinking about those. He looked at her. How much thinking? Cattail pollen sells to specialty food distributors for around $20 a pound. The east edge gets enough light that the plants are already in flower. I can't reach deep into the property yet, but the accessible stands are substantial. If I move this week before the flowers are close, I can have product ready before the window ends. Clem studied her for a moment. You've had time to think, he said. I've been cutting reeds for 2 weeks. There's not much else to do while you're cutting. He nodded once, slowly. I know a man 2 properties over with steel T-posts he's been trying to get rid of. Can't promise they're all straight, but he'll give them to anyone willing to haul them. She looked at him. He was already turning toward his truck. 60% straight is 60% of a fence I don't have, she said. He made a sound that might have been agreement. I'll call him today. The Highland cattle arrived in early spring, 14 animals in a livestock trailer, and came out with the unhurried practicality of animals that have been places before and know how to assess a new situation. The largest of them, a dark red cow with horns that curved outward like a question she hadn't asked yet, walked directly to the nearest stand of phragmites, pulled a cane down with her teeth, chewed, considered, and pulled another one. They always do that, Tessa asked Lou, the man who had driven the trailer. Every time, Lou said. She stood at the fence for a long time after Lou drove away and watched the cattle work the reed edge. They moved with a purposefulness she hadn't quite expected. Not random, but following some logic of their own, taking the accessible growth methodically, moving along the edge the way animals move when they understand what they're doing. It was the first afternoon in 3 weeks that Tessa had stood still and watched something work without being the thing doing the working. She felt something she would not have admitted to anyone out loud, which was the particular relief of not being alone in this anymore. Clem appeared at her shoulder. He had come out that morning to help with the arrival, and apparently hadn't left. Good stock, he said, watching the lead cow. Bess breeds them right. He watched for a while without saying anything. Then, my wife used to say that a long project teaches you how to wait without feeling like you're wasting time. He paused, looked at his hands on the top fence rail. She was better at that lesson than I was. Tessa said nothing, because there was nothing that would improve it. The dark red cow moved deeper into the paddock, pulling at canes, breathing steam into the cold spring air. Bryce Alderman came in June in a gray SUV with Idaho plates. He was medium height, dressed practically in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't quite. He had the manner of someone who has spent a long time learning how to appear patient. He knocked on the door of the small cabin she had built in April with help from Clem and a neighboring rancher named Frank Hollis, who had shown up one Saturday with lumber and no explanation. The cabin was rough. It was also hers, and she had been deliberate about building it on the property rather than continuing to live in ways that made her look more precarious than she was. She opened the door. On the table behind her was the county surveyor's map she had been working from, weighted at the corners with a coffee mug and a spare battery. She did not move the map. Mrs. Mowry, Alderman said, I have an interest in the water resources adjacent to your property. I'd like to discuss a purchase arrangement. I know who you are, she said. Come in. He came in and looked at the cabin interior and the map with the practiced neutrality of a man whose profession requires him not to let his face do his negotiating. He sat down. I'll be direct, he said. I need water access for a development project on the plateau land above your south fence. I understand the old Alcott Millrace may still be structurally intact. I'm prepared to make a fair offer for the property itself or for a permanent easement on the water rights. He named a number. It was $94,000. Tessa felt it land on her, the weight of it, the way it made everything she had built, the fence, the cattle, the cabin, the path cut by hand on the first day, feel suddenly negotiable. She let the feeling happen and didn't let it show. What is the plateau land worth with reliable water access? She said. A brief pause. That's a complex assessment. Your estimate. He looked at her. She watched him revise something behind his eyes. A developed sporting property on 400 acres with guaranteed water. You're looking at somewhere between 1 and 1.4 million, depending on the build. And you're offering me $94,000 for the access that makes 1 million possible. A pause. He did not answer. I haven't found the Millrace yet, she said. But I know where it is, and I have a surveyor coming next week to document the structure and file the prior appropriation claim with the state engineer's office. I have an attorney in Boise who finds my situation legally interesting. She leaned back in her chair. I'm not selling, and I'm not granting an easement at a price I haven't had independently assessed. If you want to come back with something that reflects what this water is actually worth to your project, I'll listen." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of wind off the river. "You could be waiting a long time," he said. "I've been cutting phragmites by hand in the rain," she said. "Waiting is something I'm getting better at." He picked up his card from where he'd placed it at the table's edge, looked at it, set it back down. "I'll be in touch," he said, and stood up. She watched him drive down the track to the county road. Then she went to check on the cattle. The Millrace announced itself the way important things do, not with drama, but with a sound. It was late July, and she was moving the herd through the south section, which had opened up substantially over the spring and now showed bare ground, in places where the reeds had stood solid in February. She was thinking about the additional fencing she needed before fall. The lead cow stopped near the south bend and lowered her head. She stepped forward carefully, the way cattle move when they are reading something beneath them rather than in front of them. Then she stopped again, and Tessa heard it, a hollow resonance, low and solid, like stone answering weight. Tessa crouched. In the cleared band where the cattle had worked the ground down, at the base of the remaining reed stand, she could see a line of cut stone. Not field stone. Dressed granite, fitted close, deliberate. She could see 4 blocks clearly and the beginning of a 5th, and the surface beneath the lead cow was curved slightly in the way drainage channels are shaped to move water efficiently. She stood up and let out one slow breath. She called Clem. He picked up on the second ring. "It's here," she said. A pause. He knew exactly what she meant. Where? South Bend, about 15 feet off the east bank. A longer pause. She heard something shift in his voice that she hadn't heard from him before, a quality she could only describe as relief, like something he had been holding a long time and hadn't allowed himself to hold. "Don't do anything foolish," he said. "I never do anything foolish. You bought 68 acres of swamp for $274. That's not foolish. That's specific." He made a sound that was definitely a short laugh and hung up. She spent the next 3 days clearing around the Millrace, working with the patience she had built over 5 months of understanding that this land did not reward hurrying. What came into the light was extraordinary in the quiet way that things built to function are always extraordinary. The channel was 6 feet wide and cut to a depth she couldn't fully see from above, the dressed granite set without mortar and held by 138 years of its own geometry. The intake structure at the river end was intact. The outflow on the south side had partially collapsed, but was repairable. The stonework was not decorative. It was the work of people who had cared what they were building, and built it to outlast themselves. She photographed everything. She sent 4 photographs to Clem with no caption, because no caption was needed. She sent 2 to Bess Langford, who responded within 10 minutes with a single line. "Your father would have sat beside that water for an hour at least." Tessa stood with her phone and looked at that message for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and went back to work. The drought arrived in August without warning or apology. It was the driest stretch in Halcott County in 35 years, and by the second week of September, the Slate River was running at 40% of its normal late summer level. Shallow wells across the county were dropping. The benchland above the river had no surface water at all, except what came through the old Alcott diversion point, which meant through Tessa's property, through the Millrace she had filed on in August, with the prior appropriation claim her attorney in Boise had helped her document and submit to the state engineer's office. Her cattle told her first that something was changing. They began moving differently, ranging to the spring in the afternoons with a purposefulness that was different from their usual pattern. The spring, which came up through fractured rock in the northwest corner, was still running. The Millrace intake, partially repaired, was still pulling river water into the catch basin she and Clem had built in July. Her land was holding. Frank Hollis came to her gate on a Thursday morning. He was a large man in his late 50s, with the physical permanence of someone who had farmed the same ground his whole life. "Your spring's still up," he said. Not a question. He had been watching the property. "Yes." He looked at the cleared section and the cattle working the far end. "My well's at 14 feet. Was at 40 in May. He set his hands on the top rail. I've got 60 head. If I lose the well in the next 3 weeks, I need somewhere to bring them. She looked at him. Frank Hollis had shown up with lumber on a Saturday in April and built half her cabin without being asked and without making it a thing. Where would you bring them in? She said. He blinked, just slightly, like he had prepared himself for a different answer. Through your south gate, if you'll allow it. I'll allow it, she said. Keep them rotated through the east section and off the reed-cleared ground in the northwest that soil is still establishing. But we can work out the details. He was quiet for a moment, with an expression, doing several things at once, and not performing any of them. Then he nodded, once, the way men like Frank Hollis nod when words aren't adequate, and they know it. I want to pay you something for this, he said. When the rain comes back, she said. Right now, let's keep your cattle alive. By the 3rd week of September, there were Frank's cattle and 2 other small herds sharing rotation on Tessa's property. She was sleeping 5 hours a night and managing a chart on the cabin wall that tracked every animal and every water access schedule. It was work she hadn't designed for and hadn't planned for, and it was as real as anything she had ever done, the kind of real that only comes from necessity. Dale Tripp came on a Wednesday morning and pulled over at her gate. She was coming out of the south section and saw his truck and saw him see her. And she knew from his posture that this had not been an accident. He got out slowly. He looked at the cleared section, at the cabin on the hill, at the cattle moving in the far paddock. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere in his thinking that he hadn't expected to go. I heard what you've been doing here, he said. She waited. My brother-in-law has a place on the north bench, 80 head of stalker cattle. His creek ran dry 2 weeks ago, and he's been too proud to ask anyone for anything. He paused, looked at his hands. I drove past here yesterday and counted 3 different operations using your water. 4 as of Monday, she said. He made a sound that was close to a short laugh. Then he looked at her directly, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen from him before, not the easy authority of the courthouse, but something older and harder and more honest. I wasn't kind to you when you bought this land, he said. I wasn't kind. No, she said, you weren't. He took that without arguing it. Can you take his cattle? She ran through her chart in her head, the spring output, the catch basin capacity, the sections that could handle rotation, and the one section that could not. The numbers were tight. Tight was not the same as impossible. Tell him to call me tonight, she said. We'll work out a schedule. Dale Tripp looked at her with an expression that had the weight of recognizing a mistake in it. Not a flash of it, but the full settled weight. Thank you, he said. It came out roughly, like a word that had been stored somewhere it didn't fit. Keep your brother-in-law's cattle alive, she said. That's all. He got back in his truck and drove away. She stood at the gate for a moment. Then she turned back toward the south section, because there were trough levels to check, and there were always trough levels to check, and the work of keeping something alive does not pause for moments of grace. Bryce Alderman came back in October, after the rains had returned and the river was climbing again, and the county had started breathing. He drove the same gray SUV, but he came differently this time. He parked at the gate and waited for her to come to him, rather than going to the cabin door. And when she walked out to meet him, she saw that the careful neutrality he'd worn in June was still present but changed. Less protective, more considered. Like he'd thought about this visit in a different way than he'd thought about the others. I've been watching what you did here this summer, he said. His voice was neutral in a way that sounded deliberate. I was managing a drought, she said. You made yourself into the most important piece of infrastructure in this county for 3 months. He paused. I've been thinking about what that means. He looked at the cleared section, the cattle visible through the south gate, the catch basin he could see from the road. He looked at all of it for a long moment. I'm withdrawing my purchase offer, he said. I'd like to discuss a legitimate easement arrangement for the water rights, negotiated at an independently assessed rate, annual payment indexed to inflation. He paused. I'd also like to offer to fund the Millrace structural assessment at my own cost. She looked at him. She had prepared herself for several versions of Bryce Alderman coming back. She had not prepared for this one. My attorney in Boise will need to be part of that conversation, she said. I assumed as much. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. I'd expect nothing less. She put her hand out. He shook it. It was not friendship. It was two people who had been on opposite sides of something acknowledging that the something had changed what was possible between them, and deciding that was enough to work from. Her name is Adele Marsh, Tessa said. I'll tell her to expect your call. He got back in the SUV. He drove away at a measured pace. When the dust settled, she turned back toward the property, because there were animals to check, and there were always animals to check, and a conflict resolving into something functional is not as dramatic as winning, but is considerably more durable. Bess Langford came in November. She drove herself, which Tessa had not expected. She was 72 years old and had been talking for 2 years about not driving distances anymore, which had not prevented her from driving 2 counties in any direction whenever she decided she felt like it. She got out slowly and stood at the original fence gap, the one Tessa had stood at on the first night with a flashlight and a thin sleeping bag, and looked at what was there now. The cleared front section, the cabin on the hill, the cattle moving in the near paddock with the easy purposefulness of animals on ground that suited them. The reed line, which had retreated substantially from the fence, and now showed bare ground in broad swaths, where a year ago there had been nothing but canes standing 12 feet tall. Bess was quiet for a long time. "Walk me to the Millrace," she said. They walked the cleared path together, Bess at a careful pace that Tessa set her own pace to match without making a thing of it. The path was wide now, properly maintained, with the recovery grasses coming in along both edges where the reeds had been cut back. In several sections, small native willows had begun establishing themselves along the water drainage, moving back into ground that had been theirs before the phragmites pushed them out. The Millrace appeared as it always appeared when you came at it from the north. First, the sound of water moving through stone, then the intake structure, then the full length of the channel visible in the November light. Bess stopped when she saw it. She walked to the near edge and put her hand on the top course of dressed granite and held it there. "Dry set," she said, "not one crack in the face course." 138 years, and it's still level, Tessa said. Bess looked at the water moving through the channel, slow and clear in the cold. She kept her hand on the stone. "Your father would have sat beside this water for an hour," she said, "at least." Tessa looked at the channel. She didn't trust herself to say anything for a moment, so she didn't, and Bess, who understood what certain silences needed, didn't push it. "The difference between your father and you," Bess said finally, "is that Glen Mowry would have loved this land and still been renting the ground he was standing on." She paused. "You own the spring." "I own the spring," Tessa said. Bess made the sound that was related to a laugh. "He would have been so proud of you, and he would not have known what to do with that feeling at all." They stood together on the bank of the Millrace in the November cold, and the water ran through the channel it had been cut for 138 years ago, patient and indifferent and constant in the way that water always is, doing what it does, going where it goes, remembering nothing, and forgetting nothing. The county assessor's office sent a revised valuation in December. Tessa opened the envelope standing at the cabin door in her work jacket. The reed bottom had been reassessed at $740 per acre, based on cleared and productive acreage, documented prior appropriation water rights, the historic Millrace, formerly noted as a county landmark in the assessor's correspondence, and the established agricultural use history represented by the existing grazing operation and the hay production she had started in the south section in September. 68 acres at $740 an acre. She did the arithmetic standing in the doorway. Then she sat down on the porch step and held the letter and let the numbers sit beside each other in her head. The $274 that had bought all of this, and what all of this had become. For exactly as long as it took for the feeling to settle into something she could carry, rather than something she was inside. She thought about her father, not the part of him that had failed, which was the part everyone else referenced and used as shorthand for a particular kind of man who couldn't make practical reality match his understanding of the land. She thought about the part of him that had taken a 9-year-old girl down to a river bottom on a Sunday afternoon and spent an hour explaining why certain grasses grew where they did, why water knew where to go, why ground that looked ruined was often just ground that hadn't been asked the right question yet. She had asked the right question. She stood up and went back to work, because there were cattle to check, and water levels to monitor, and a letter to write to Adele Marsh about the easement terms. And the land she was standing on was hers, and it had not stopped teaching her things, and she did not intend to stop listening. The lead cow was in the south section when Tessa came through the gate, pulling at the last substantial stand of phragmites near the river bend, working with the slow thoroughness that had characterized every day of the past 8 months. The reeds were down to perhaps a third of their original density across the property. Another season, 2 at most, and the ground beneath them would be visible. The soil that had been there all along, below 40 years of growth, patient in the way that land is patient, which is to say completely and without condition, and for as long as it takes. She stood at the gate in the December afternoon and watched the cattle work, and she thought about her father, who had known this valley and never had the money to act on what he knew. She had acted. She had bought 68 acres of reed and water and buried history for $274, and she had gone back to it every morning, and she had refused to stop until it showed her what it was. The land had shown her. Everything else had followed from that.